Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy. Retake Our Democracy is a weekly radio show, a 30-minute show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your Santa Fe public radio station. And I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. Today, I will be speaking with Jeff Haas, author of the book, The Assassination of Fred Hampton, a decades-long civil rights attorney and the husband of Mariel Nanasi, executive director of New Energy Economy. In a curious twist of fate, last week I interviewed Mariel for the show, and so we will have back-to-back for the very first time a husband and wife team on Retake Our Democracy. And in another coincidence, Mariel and Jeff will be at our house for dinner tonight to celebrate my 70th birthday, which is actually today. So happy birthday, Paul, and welcome to being 70. As noted last week, we spoke with Mariel Nanasi, and one of Retake Our Democracy's most important allies is New Energy Economy. And we discussed the legislative session, the failure of so many important energy and gas and oil legislation, the governor's actions related to Biden's fracking moratorium, and PNM's pending acquisition by a national mega corporation, Avangrid. The week prior, Roxanne and I talked together about the Roundhouse session that was just completed, and we discussed some of the big wins, some of the big disappointments, and more importantly, what we learned from the session and what we can carry forward in future sessions. And over the past week, I've interviewed 10 legislators about the session, and I can only say that I've learned more in those very candid interviews than I've learned in 5 years of advocacy at the Roundhouse. Very illuminating. Look for much of that to be reported in the report card that's going to be coming out soon. But I still have 10 more interviews to do next week before I get started. If you're driving around today and don't catch all of today's show, you can watch today's show and all of our past shows by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and hovering over the Actions and Events menu and clicking on Retake Conversations. And that you'll find all those shows there. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that we are conducting this interview on stolen Tewa land. I want to acknowledge and thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of the land. And we could learn a good deal from them. And last night, Roxanne and I had, or actually Thursday night, Roxanne and I had the opportunity to watch a Red Nation presentation where they launched the Red Deal. And I've purchased the book, can't wait to get my hands on it. It was a tremendous panel discussion, and if we can get a tape of it, we'll put it up on our Retake page. So before we get, finally, I want to mention that Retake Our Democracy is launching a 501c3 tax-deductible organization, Rethink Our Democracy. We now have a menu bar on our homepage, so if you go to retakeourdemocracy.org, just click on Rethink, and you can find our scope of work, our a video of our launch meeting, which was on Wednesday, and where Roxanne and I laid out all that would be involved in the Rethink initiative, and also ways in which you can get involved. In brief, it's going to focus on taking a far deeper dive into a range of transformational issues and policies and model programs and possible legislation that could accelerate a just and sustainable transition in New Mexico. And as part of that, what we're going to try and do is bring legislation to the Roundhouse rather than just reacting to legislation at the Roundhouse. So it's a very exciting endeavor. We had 30 volunteers on our launch conversation. We had some people who said they wanted to help with fundraising. They had people who said they wanted to help with research. And they had people who wanted to help us with partner formation. So, and if you want to get a sense of what one of our briefs will look like, go to retakeourdemocracy.org and click on the Sustainable Agriculture blog that came out on Monday. It's not exactly what it's going to look like when we do these briefs, but it's getting close. And we'll be sharing those as they're developed in the blog that we send out. So that's about as much as I want to tell you. I'm eager to get to Jeff. He's a font of information on all things criminal justice. And so with no further ado, welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, Paul. I'm glad to be here. And also I want to recognize the tremendous contribution that you and Roxanne have made to educating us and activating us in Santa Fe to issues locally, statewide, and nationally. And I think you really have played a tremendous service, and I hope the 501c3 goes well so that you can continue to and expand your outreach.
Yeah. I mean, the big picture reason for this is that, I'm 70 and at some point I'm not going to be able to do this. And so we want to make this a sustainable organization. And so we're going to get some staff, just small staff, a community liaison and a research director. And that would mirror the roles Roxanne and I play, but then they'd be staff and they'd be able to take on the role as we shepherd it along. So
I'm sure you'll still get up at 6 in the morning, but maybe by 8 at night you'll rest.
Well, no, I'm pretty good at unplugging by about 5.
Okay.
But when we unplug, what we do is, like we watched the Red Nation thing last night. And so, it's not a total unplug, but it's not sitting there, on the computer pecking. So enough about that. How about this? Jeff, you've been on the show, but I'm not sure all of our listeners are going to know your background and why I wanted you on the show. So tell us a little bit about how you became a civil rights attorney, your role in the Fred Hampton legal effort after he was assassinated.
Well, I won't go into too much history, but I graduated from the University of Chicago Law School in 1967 and initially started working for legal aid. But this young man by the name of Fred Hampton came to some of us lawyers and said, we need a people's law office. We need representation because the Panthers, the Young Lords, the Young Patriots, SDS, the anti-war movement is getting busted every time we step out in the street, every time we have a demonstration or sell a newspaper. So 4 of us started the People's Law Office in 1969 in August. And we were busy from the first day we opened, needless to say, because the Chicago police were in fact harassing our clients. But on December 4th, 1969, about 3 months after we opened, my partner knocked on my back door. And when I opened it, he said, the chairman's been killed. The police raided his crib this morning. And that started a saga that lasted for 13 years. I went to the police station where Fred Hampton's fiance, 8 months pregnant with their child, their soon-to-be-born child, told me what happened and told me that the police came in firing. And when they got to her bedroom, they pulled her out and then went in. And she said, one of the police said, is he dead yet? She heard 2 shots and the other policeman said, he's good and dead now. And so what started then was our effort to expose what
it was
really
self-defense, wasn't it?
Yeah, he was mostly asleep and the policeman was about 24 inches away with a revolver who shot him. And of course, that led to a civil suit. First, we had to defend the other Panther survivors. Fred and Mark were killed. Mark Clark was at the front door. 4 Panthers were shot and 3 others were just beat up. So first we had to confront the public statement of the prosecutor, very much like today when the police put their own spin on whatever happens. In particular, we noticed with George Floyd, the original report was by the Minneapolis police was that it was a mental health or a physical health incident. So suddenly he just died in the middle of
that in a little bit there, Jeff.
Yes. Anyway, so we proved with the physical evidence that in fact it was a shoot-in, not a shootout. 90 shots, only 1 came from Mark Clark after he had been hit. It went into the ceiling. But after we did that, after we got the criminal charges dropped, we filed a civil suit. And it turned out that in the process, we learned that not only was the Chicago police involved, but the FBI had set up the raid by providing the Chicago police a floor plan that even included the bed where Hampton and Johnson, Deborah Johnson, his fiance, would be sleeping. And also that they provided the local police with false information about illegal weapons there. As we dug deeper, and as the Church Commission was digging deeper, we learned that this was part of an FBI COINTELPRO program that targeted the entire movement, but in particular the Black movement and the Black Panthers, who Hoover declared was the greatest threat to the security of the United States. So that took a long time, but eventually we got a settlement, and I think we brought out information that showed this was a planned conspiracy and assassination. So that I continued. That was I was only 3 or 4 years out of law school when that started, and our People's Law Office still continues in Chicago. I stayed there for 35 years, and have somewhat continued as a civil rights attorney out here. Everything from representing Mora County, trying to stop fracking there. And most recently, I've been one of the attorneys, I was one of the attorneys at Standing Rock defending the water protectors.
And you wrote a book about the Fred Hampton.
And 40 years afterwards, when I had time not to have to be in court, I wrote The Assassination of Fred Hampton, How the FBI and Chicago Police Murdered a Black Panther.
Wow.
And so that book outlines much of the information that is the basis for the current movie, Judas and the Black Messiah.
Yeah, and that segues nicely into my next question. What an interviewer. What did you think of Judas and the Black Messiah? We saw it just the other night. What do you think?
Well, it's hard when you know so much to look at a movie which captures a part of it. They don't even attempt to say, how did Fred Hampton get to be who he was, such a great orator and such a great gatherer of people and organizations, nor does it movie deal with how we uncovered what happens in the movie, which is shown in real time. On the other hand, I think it was a very powerful portrayal of Fred Hampton. I think Daniel Kaluuya did a great job. They turned it into a drama of Hampton versus O'Neill,
Right.
Which, while it created great drama, the Othello Iago story, sort of, or the villain, and of course we had a fantastic portrayal of the villain by Lakeith Stanfield. Still, I think it missed the point that it was the FBI, not
Right.
just one informant, who murdered Fred Hampton.
Right.
And O'Neill was a willing tool. Actually, they call him an informant. I saw something that said, really, he was an infiltrator. He wasn't a Panther who flipped. He was sent into the Panthers by the FBI to spy on them.
Right.
And
I thought one of the things that was interesting was it did do a good job of showing how Hampton created alliances with, the conservative white community, with the Hispanic community, and I thought that was quite compelling.
it was, and it's almost unique. In the first Rainbow Coalition that the Panthers, the Young Lords, and the Young Patriots started is quite remarkable. And it had other groups, and Fred also attempted to build alliances with the Chicago street gangs. But yes, the fact that he could go into Uptown to a group of young white Appalachian men and women who had left West Virginia, who originally had Confederate flags on their caps, and still talk to them about their common issues of police brutality, poor schooling, poor housing. And I don't want to imply that they accepted the inherent racism of the Confederacy. I think the white groups came to realize that many of their icons and so forth were racist. And in joining with the Panthers, they actually changed their politics.
Well, it just occurred to me that it would be akin to the Black Lives Matter, coalescing with the Proud Boys, and organizing together. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, that might be a slight overstatement, but it gives you a sense of the courage that it took for him to walk into that meeting and say to them with their Confederate flag up in the back, you know, let's talk.
Yeah, I don't think the Young Patriots had ideologically set on a path like the Proud Boys. They were from the South and they somewhat highly regarded their tradition. But in a recent interview, one of their leaders said, you know, it wasn't like we're gonna you should be proud that we're joining you. They said to the Panthers, look, what do you need us as an ally for? We're a poor white group that's almost as pressed as you, and we have to deal with white people who look to other white people for their heroes. What are you gaining by this? So I think that was the attitude of some of the leaders of the Young Patriots, that they realized the Panthers raised some of their issues, and rather than looking at white people as the solution, they looked at alliances of the oppressed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, let's start a discussion of the state of the criminal justice system right now as relates to African Americans. I'd like to talk generally first about your views about whether or not the nation and New Mexico are actually making anything like credible progress towards eliminating racial bias in policing and district attorney offices, et cetera.
Well, I think, you know, as Hamlet said, how all occasions do inform against us, and certainly how all occasions do inform against proper policing. We've seen so many police murders on video cams in the last few days that obviously something, and it isn't what is new. I guess what's somewhat new is the fact that these things have been gathered on video cams.
Right.
So the issues are there. Well, you know, we've seen it. And obviously the George Floyd case stood out because I think as Chauvin was kneeling on his neck, he was looking at the people and saying, in a way, there's nothing to see here, don't worry, or I don't care if you film me doing
Right.
this, I'm immune, I can get away with this,
Right.
so
Right.
go ahead. And I'm even gonna keep my knee on his neck after he's dead, almost as some kind of show thing. The story that the ambulance drivers had to actually get him off to provide CPR is just horrifying. And the fact that the other officers went along with it. So how far we have to go, and that was a progressive city, is there for us all to see. And I think there's been recognition of the problem in many places. Now, bringing about systematic change is very difficult. You do have a history of police unions having a whole lot of power, both politically and who they endorse, but also writing contracts that basically protect police. And we used to say in Chicago, I don't think the police union has ever seen a case of police brutality that they didn't like. They're out there no matter what, defending and having a big effect on what the public statement is about the incident. Mm-hmm. So that has to be taken on, and I don't think that's been changed very much. I do think there's a recognition that the issues of training and accountability are really critical and have been insufficient. And also the question of what kind of resources do we put into the police versus other opportunities that might prevent these situations from occurring. Right. So I think all those things are up for grabs, and I think most public officials and police departments have acknowledged it and taken some steps, but I think we have a long, long way to go.
Well, I have to take a second here and remind our listeners that it's times like these that KSFR is more important than ever. While you're holed up in quarantine, although we're starting to get liberated. I get to have Marielle and Jeff to our house for dinner tonight. But KSFR, even in non-pandemic, is a great resource. They offer news and alerts and a wide range of programming to keep you sane and to keep you informed. So for those of you who can afford it, maybe some of you just got a relief check, that maybe you don't need too much, share a little bit of it with KSFR. You can just go to ksfr.org, click on the donate button, and look at it as your ticket for admission to some really great programming. And so we're going to get back to Jeffrey Haas. He is the, well, he's not an executive director of anything anymore. He is an attorney in civil rights and the author of the assassination of Fred Hampton. So let's get back to the conversation. You know, we were talking just a little bit just now about the Chauvin case and the general state of advances or lack thereof in relation to police, public safety, and police violence. Obviously, the big news this week has been the conviction of Derek Chauvin. And as a civil rights attorney, what is your take on the importance of the trial and the conviction? And do you think this in any way could foretell future convictions in similar murder cases?
Well, I guess that remains to be seen. I mean, there were so many things happening in the Chauvin case that sometimes make it unique and sometimes make it more similar. First of all, there was obviously the video, and that 9-minute video, if everybody knew what happened, there was no question. So the question is he going to be held accountable? Right. And as you pointed out, and initially, basically they said that he died of medical distress during a struggle with the police, was sort of the Minneapolis original report. I'm going to read
that to the radio audience in just a second. So,
okay. So what did it take to overcome the immediate reflex of the police department to cover up what happened? And so, as I said, it took the video, it took the bystanders. Basically, maybe most important, it took 30 million people in the streets for months and months, for not allowing us to forget what happened to George Floyd, right. Not allowing us to forget that image and see that image over and over again. You also had that the district attorney, who originally apparently put up a kind of a lame charge. Unfortunately, that was taken over by the state attorney general, who appointed, I think if we saw the trial, a very, very competent prosecution staff.
Right.
So all those things happened. They also, I think, had 6 Black people on the jury, which is somewhat unusual. So all those factors together, I think, resulted in what would have been hard to explain had it not been a guilty on all counts.
Right.
And so in a way, you had to feel good. It's a drama. If he had gotten off, it would have been a really miscarriage of justice.
Yeah, yeah.
So the question is that going to be an example in future cases, or is it going to be something that stands out as somewhat unique? You don't have a Keith Ellison as an attorney general in most states, who really was a former guild lawyer and did civil rights cases.
Right.
So all of those factors, I think, had a big impact.
Okay. Well, I want to read to our listeners what they actually published the night of the incident, the murder. And this is a direct quote. 2 officers arrived and located the suspect, a male believed to be in his 40s, in his car. He was ordered to step from his car. After he got out, he physically resisted officers. Officers were able to get the suspect into handcuffs and noted he appeared to be suffering medical distress. Officers called for an ambulance. He was transported to Hennepin County Medical Center by ambulance, where he died a short time later. There's so much wrong with that statement that it's almost not worth picking apart. But of most I mean, they say he died in the hospital, you know, after the event. And they don't mention anything about the police doing anything to him. In fact, they noticed that he was having distress and they got an ambulance to him. So it was so far from what really happened. It's just unbelievable, you know?
Well, it is unbelievable, but for many, many years, we did civil rights cases before there were video cams. And we had to uncover, we were always faced with the police lie about what happened.
Mhm.
And so until video cams came out, it was very difficult because there's the code of silence. So the other officers would either back up the perpetrator's story or say they didn't see anything.
Right.
And so it's not surprising they tried this here. Obviously, it was totally taken apart piece by piece. Between the omissions and the misrepresentations, it's almost humorous how far off they were.
Right.
Particularly the fact that he was dead for 5 minutes under his knee, and then they claimed he died in the hospital as though from some kind of previous medical or mental distress, physical distress situation.
Yeah, it was pretty appalling. We've got about 3 minutes left, and so let's take a couple minutes to answer this question, and then I'll give you a chance to tell people where they can get your book, and we'll sign off, and then we'll do the podcast. So there's going to be plenty more on the podcast. We're about halfway through, folks. Aside from the video itself, what do you think was the key evidence that presented that contributed to the conviction?
I think, well, it's hard to separate. The video told us what happened.
Right.
But I also think the prosecution made us feel how George Floyd felt in those 9 minutes, the different stages and the desperation that he felt trying to cling to life. And I think for a jury, you need the mental part, but you also need the emotional part. And so when we heard, and the medical experts and the eyewitnesses told us how George Floyd was trying to struggle to get air to breathe, I think that emotionally had a tremendous impact, had an impact on me. So I think that combined with seeing the obvious facts were very powerfully presented, and I think resulted in a pretty quick verdict.
Oh yeah, it was really fast. One of the things I wondered about too was I don't recall seeing a case like this where so many police officers on the scene all said, no, that was not appropriate, including the police chief. That seemed to me to be striking. What about you?
It is pretty unique. Usually you won't find anybody in the police department, the same police department as the officer, when you're bringing a civil rights suit, and you have to find an expert from some other place.
Right.
So it was very unusual. And I think that could be a very, very important pattern. But in reforming police departments, you have to get rid of the code of silence. You have to prosecute officers who lie. Even in Laquan McDonald, where he gets convicted, where the officer gets convicted of shooting him 16 times, the other officers who saw it, who lied, who pretended as though Laquan McDonald had lunged at the officers, even though the video showed he didn't, they got off. So I think, and also I think what's been raised recently is a duty to intervene. What about the other officers who were on top of George Floyd, who were actually aiding and abetting what Chauvin was doing? So
Right.
I think prosecuting them would go a long way, so that police don't feel immune.
Okay. Well, can you tell our listeners where they can get your book? I bet it's at Collected Works.
It's definitely a Collected Works. It's at Garcia. It's basically at all the bookstores, and of course on Amazon and virtually. So it's actually been a bestseller for a period, particularly when the Black Lives Matter rose, and then again recently because of Judas and the Black Messiah. So if they go to the assassination of Fred Hampton, they'll find it. I urge you to go through your local bookstore and support them.
Oh, you took the words out of my mouth. And thank you, Jeff, for being with us. We're going to continue this discussion on our podcast. And I just want to thank our listeners for being with us today. We'll be back again next week. In the interim, stay safe, stay healthy, but most importantly, stay active. It's the only way we fix this mess. We'll be back next week. By the miracle of podcast, we're back with Jeff Haas. And oh, I know what I want to ask you. Somebody you know very well, I don't remember who this was, kept referring to you as Jeff Haas. Is that's I mean, the Haas, I know the Haas family from Bay Area, Levi Strauss and stuff like that. I've never heard it pronounced Haas. Was that just mispronounced?
No, I've never heard, I actually never heard that. Well, I grew up in the South. So Haas, which is probably closer to the original German Dutch pronunciation, we used Has, which was sort of a Southern corruption. But when I've been in the North, it's Haas, but Hayes doesn't quite fit. I don't think.
All right. Well, that wasn't a tough question. One more question on the Chauvin conviction. We hear all the time that 90% of the cops are good cops and 10% are bad cops who damage the reputation of departments. Yet we've talked a little bit about this, but police departments do all they can to protect both good cops and bad cops. And, we saw that there were plenty of officers on the scene there and nobody intervened. But what do you think the response to this conviction will be in police departments and district attorney offices across the nation?
Well, I hope it will be something that makes it a penalty that you lose your job and possibly get prosecuted for covering up for someone who's doing an obvious civil rights violation or violation of the criminal law, because murder is both a criminal law, but also a violation of their training and procedures. And so in the past, there usually is no penalty for the code of silence, for the 90% saying they didn't see what the 10% did or didn't intervene. And so I think we really have to deal with that. I don't know if those numbers are correct, but I think it's true that most police officers don't go out with intentional racism to try to harm people unnecessarily. There is certainly an amount of unconscious race bias and has to be dealt with in terms of training. But there is this lockstep for the officers who do that. And so there's no penalty and they're immune. And the police unions stand up for those people. So somehow that lock has to be broken or changed. And so we have to take on this issue of loyalty to the rogue or to the cop who does commit brutality and is allowed. So in a way you say it's a rogue cop, but is it really, if the general psychology is, well, you can do it, we'll back you up, even if we're not the ones who particularly want to. So I don't know that makes, I think you got to deal with the code of silence. You also have to discipline those 10% who are repeaters. We did a study in Chicago and found a huge number of the disciplinary complaints were against a relatively small number of cops, but they accumulated them and they never got disciplined. And another call is for a registry. And if a police officer were to get any kind of 3 disciplinary complaints, and they're almost always unfounded or undecided, that they be investigated and perhaps disciplined and fired. And also there'd be a national registry so that if you get fired for abuse in one place, you can't go and get a police job in another place. Okay. So, I think we have to deal with those things. And if the policemen who can continuously get away with excessive force complaints and abusing people, that is a message to everybody else on the department also.
Okay, yeah, well, baby steps, I guess. In New Mexico, we managed to pass HB4, the Civil Rights Act, and that's a bill that would eliminate qualified immunity in New Mexico. Can you tell us what qualified immunity is and why HB4 is so important in relation to police violence?
Well, following the Civil War, during Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Acts were passed to say that anybody under color of law violates the constitutional rights of an individual can be sued, and they can be sued in federal court, and you get not only do you get the damages, but you get attorney's fees, which can be very significant because sometimes you have to take a case where the damages, physical injury may or may not be great, but if you're going to spend a huge amount of time doing it, there's no incentive. So the idea of attorney's fees actually, I think, is a deterrent. But more recently, the Supreme Court came up sort of out of thin air with this idea of qualified immunity. And that says that you may or may not have used excessive force, violated the Fourth Amendment, been an illegal search or seizure. But if there wasn't a prior case specifically on that point, then the officer has qualified immunity, and so does the entity, the city. In other words, let's assume you're chasing someone at night through an alley, and they start to jump a fence and they get shot, and you're chasing them for your belief that there's a warrant, let's say. So that would normally be, yes, you've used excessive force. That's a constitutional violation. The plaintiff or the victim should recover. But then the qualified immunity said, well, it's not clear. We don't have a case like that where it's night and it's dark and maybe the man had something in his hand. And so particularly a lot of the circuit courts that have become more and more conservative with Trump appointments have found, well, even if he violated your First Amendment right not to have excessive force, it wasn't a clear precedent when he did it. So we're going to disallow that case. And so that you can see that could be used as broadly as a court might want. Well, we haven't seen a case just quite like this. Now, the obvious case, the Chauvin case, I don't think you'd have a qualified immunity, but many other cases are much closer. What about the woman who shot the man thinking, pulled out her gun, claiming she was trying to pull out her taser? What about the Toledo case in Chicago, where he maybe had a gun, but dropped it, raised his hands and get shot? A court could say, well, maybe that's a violation, but we don't have a case that exactly like that. So we're going to throw it out of court. And not only that, but under the qualified immunity theory, the city or the individual could raise it to the court. I don't think there's a precedent on this. So then they had, even if the judge denied it, they had a right of appeal. And that could take a year or two. So every federal civil rights case was delayed because the city could claim qualified immunity and either win or delay a case for a year or two, which of course for a plaintiff and for a lawyer is very inhibiting. So New Mexico says you don't have qualified immunity in state court. So if you violate the state constitution, which also has a Fourth Amendment prohibition against illegal searches and seizures, and I bring a situation, the defendant can't claim qualified immunity anymore. Okay. And the state court also allows attorney's fees, which it didn't used to do in civil rights cases. So I think the idea, of course, is to prevent civil rights abuses by making it cost more money for the institutions. So it is a step forward in a way, and it does allow victims of abuse, different kinds of abuse, to get redress in the state courts easier and without having to go through a long extra legal hoop.
Okay. Well, so it's a good thing. We did something good. All right.
I think it's a good thing. Yes.
Okay. So the Albuquerque police just hired a new chief, and they've had more than enough history now of police violence. So I'm wondering if you've had an opportunity to look into the new chief and anything he said or anything that would be an indicator to you that maybe he would be, a reform advocate in the police department.
Well, I in response to the anticipation of your question, I have inquired. I've learned that the police chief, in spite of a whole history of abuse, was hired from within Medina. and he was somewhat of an outlander because apparently he had criticized the mayor previously for not cracking down on police. So in spite of that, he got chosen, which was somewhat of a surprise. He didn't have a great history, from what I understand, in terms of disciplining police. And I think he at least has somewhat talked the talk, and he says that we're going to create a public safety group that's going to deal with, instead of sending armed cops to every situation, we're going to think of it as public safety. So that's the good news. The bad news is that there are very limited number of people on it. And it turned out in the new budget that just was released in Albuquerque, the police budget went up, and there was no budget for this new entity that was supposed to be a public safety unit. So, and that, yeah, so.
Well, if a budget is a moral document, or it tells you where your priorities lie, that certainly tells you where the Mayor Keller's priorities lie.
Right, and he increased the police budget this year, and there's no apparent place for this public safety unit that is going to supposedly come into being. So, right, the budget is where not just where you put your mouth, but where you put your money, and that's pretty critical.
Yeah, well, that's a good segue again to Santa Fe. The mayor has drafted a budget, or the mayor and city council and staff have crafted a budget that's was discussed last night and will be discussed again on Monday. And in that budget, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but they did fund 3 public safety staff, and they actually put money in the budget for them this time in Santa Fe. But they also had a huge budget for police. I didn't realize how large the budget is in Santa Fe for police. And in an article I saw online, it was more than, or it wasn't in an article, it was in a letter to the mayor protesting, from Cecile Lipworth, who I know you know. In it, she asserted that the police budget was larger than all the funds for mental health, children and family services, homeless services, and I believe recreation. And so, okay, what kind of a shift does that really represent? Do you have any thoughts on the Santa Fe budget?
Well, I hear, for the same reasons you just raised, people are very skeptical. It only includes 3 people, this new public safety unit. The policeman they picked, and I think the other 2 were actually from mental health and some other department, also does not have a stellar record in terms of respect for the community. So again, it's very small. The police budget in Santa Fe, like Albuquerque, has gone up and vastly exceeds budgets for many other social services. So the creation of this unit, the public safety unit, is good, but how much power it will be given and how much budget it will be given really remains to be seen.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, and I just want to acknowledge one thing. I've long thought that the job of being a police officer, certainly they need more training, but I can't even imagine the level of awareness or fear that must go through a police officer's mind when they're pulling over a car late at night. I don't even care what color the person is in the car. There are these times where they walk up and boom, they're shot. And I think the number of times where they do the shooting is, I'd be interested in seeing that data. I don't know whether you know that. But nonetheless, I always thought that being a police officer and a social worker, where you're making the decisions about whether to pull a kid from a home or keep them there, were 2 of the more difficult jobs, because there were these decision points where sometimes, with lack of information, you had to make decisions that could have pretty profound implications. What are your thoughts on that?
I do think that's an issue, and particularly in a society where guns are so available to anybody.
Very good point.
You can't separate it, including the police. So a person might fear, well, this cop has a gun, and he might think I have a gun. So it in both ways, it really creates tension, I think. So I almost wonder if the Republicans and right wing don't want as many guns as possible to justify over policing. And to make crime an issue and violence an issue. Maybe that's too nasty, but I think the issue of guns can't be totally separated.
I agree.
And the fact that we have a society that's gone crazy on violence, and then you put that together with all the other inadequacies in the society and racism and you created a lot of jobs for the police that should be handled by other social agencies.
Yeah, I agree.
Avoided so that they don't occur at all.
Well, and I also wonder, I think it's in England where the police don't carry guns. And I think also in Japan, they don't carry guns. And they certainly, well, they don't have shootouts with police because the police don't have the guns, but I don't think they have anything like the kind of problem we have here. And in part because people don't have guns either to the degree, nearly the degree that we do here.
Absolutely. And the absurdity that, people have rights to have guns and in terms of hunting, in terms of rifles and shotguns and so forth. People don't need guns with a magazine that holds a huge number of clips. They don't need semi-automatic weapons that can be converted to automatic. And I don't really see the need for handguns in most situations. And they're overproduced and they're passed around and you can purchase them so easily. And I think this is definitely part of the problem. And unfortunately, it's the police who sometimes have to deal with that,
Right.
and the communities.
Right. Well, I myself have never touched a gun, and I guarantee you I never will. But I really want to thank you, Jeff, for being with us. And it's been a great conversation. And we'll extend the conversation in a few hours over dinner.
You certainly will.
And
well, happy birthday, Paul.
Yeah.
And I look forward to seeing you later on tonight.
Yeah.
Paul is also a great cook.
Well, tonight you're going to get my wife's cooking because the 70-year-old gets the night off.
Gets the night off.
She's making Brazilian fish stew. So that should be good. And we're going to have some smoked trout dip and cheeses and stuff. And we'll sit out on the patio and swap lies. And it's going to be great. It's what vaccinated people can now do. It's very nice, very nice. We've missed that socialization. So we'll see you later. And that's it for today on Retake Our Democracy. We'll be back next week with another great guest. And in the interim, stay safe, stay healthy, stay active. We'll be back. Thank you.